First video of 2025. Let's go. First video of 2025, and I've already forgotten my intro. Hello my friends and everyone else, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Hazel Jane and I paint crap on my face. We are returning today with another installment of my Monsters, Myths and Makeup series, but before I dive into that, there are a couple of things I just want to rattle through very quickly. First of all, I am really sorry. My posting for the end of 2024 went a bit more sporadic than I intended it to. Obviously, I took a bit of a break off after the insanity of Halloween and October, and then just kind of things kept happening. And then it got to December and I had all these things that I wanted to film, and then I got really, really sick, and then it was Christmas and New Year's and we had loads of people around. Apologies for kind of disappearing from YouTube for a little while, but I am back, I am organised, I have a planner and a notebook, so I am very clearly in control of my life now. On that same kind of note, moving forward, I am going to be doing these types of videos every other week, just because the research always ends up taking longer than I think it will, and I want to do these videos properly and do them in depth for you. Last note on that, and again kind of tying it all together, I did put a community post up the other day, but if you haven't seen it, over on my Instagram page I have now set up a broadcast channel. If you go onto my profile, there's a little link for it, but basically it is kind of a bit like a group chat, but it's mainly a way for me to be able to interact with you guys a bit more directly. I want more feedback and input from you, whether it's helping you pick certain themes for episodes or helping you choose what kind of content you want to see, as well as sharing updates on filming and release dates, that kind of thing. So if you don't want to miss anything relating to these videos, I would highly suggest that you join that little group. I've also started sharing some like behind the scenes stuff, little shots of like props that I make or things that go into preparation for these videos. But the main thing that I want to start doing is to do with images and artwork. So when I do the editing and the research for these videos, obviously there's a lot of references to different creatures and things like that. Some of the stuff that's really old, like a lot of Greek mythology, most of the images that I can find are in the public domain, so I'm free to use them. However, certain lesser known creatures or more modern creatures, a lot of the images around them are very much copyrighted, and I do not want copyright strikes. But it does mean that sometimes I can't include as many images as I would like. So I thought it could be a really fun idea to get more involved with like a kind of community sense, because I know a lot of the people who watch my videos are creatives, whether it's makeup or art, painting, drawing. So to the point that I'm actually trying to make, I thought it could be quite fun if each week on the episode I could do like a little community artwork feature. So basically anyone watching, if you would like to be involved in this, if you make any kind of artwork or depictions or other makeup looks or just anything creative inspired by or depicting some of the creatures that I'm covering, I would like to feature them in the videos as a way to showcase what I'm talking about without getting copyright striked. Also as a kind of way of involving you guys a bit more. I want that little like community vibe. Obviously it's completely up to you whether you wanted to submit anything or if you wanted to be involved. Obviously anyone who does would be fully credited, links, that kind of thing, both in the video and in the description. But if you want to be involved in that, please let me know either by commenting down below, or probably the best way would be to join the broadcast channel on Instagram, because as I say, that's where I'll be giving information about upcoming videos, so that if you did want to take part, you have time to prepare whatever it is you wanted to include. I realise I've just done a lot of the information and intros for this video kind of a bit backwards. So for anyone who is new here, hi. Welcome to my little series where we get to delve into the weird and wonderful world of monsters and myths and legends. Each episode I will be trying to bring these stories to life through a makeup look inspired by the creatures behind the legends. This week's episode is one that has been requested a few times, and it kind of harks back to one of a previous video where I briefly mentioned them, but we are looking at pixies. Freshly caught Cornish pixies. So, grab a Red Bull, grab a Monster, grab a water, grab a seat, and let's dive in. For those of you who are interested in the makeup side of things, I will leave a link to all the products that I use in the description box down below. And as always, I will apologise in advance for any errors in pronunciation of words, names, places, that thing. Some of this research takes me to stories from all over the world, and I do try my best to pronounce them correctly, but I often don't. So apologies in advance if I do butcher any words. Please feel free to correct me in the comments down below if I do get them wrong. So in one of my previous videos, I spoke briefly about a place called Dartmoor, which is a moorland area in Devon here in the UK. Now this area is particularly known for having like a lot of folklore and myth and sort of superstition associated with it. One of the main ones being that it is often considered to be home to one of the largest concentrations of pixies. Now pixies are often categorized alongside, and in some cases confused with, things like fairies and imps and sprites and anything kind of like small little creatures. But pixies specifically are from British folklore, mainly in areas such as like Devon, Dorset, Cornwall, and almost sort of Somerset area. Whilst they're most commonly known as pixies, there is a lot of variation in terms of the spelling and slight pronunciation of the name, because they're also known as piskies, pixie with a Y or an IE, Pizkie with a ZKIE, or Pigsy. Like, a lot of it's regional and it all kind of basically makes the same word, but there's a weird amount of variation on it. One of the most famous pixies is Tinkerbell from Disney's adaptation of Peter Pan, because in the original play and novel she was actually a fairy, but it was a choice by Disney to refer to her and present her as a pixie. Now, because of the association with Devon and Cornwall areas, there are some who believe that pixies have some form of Celtic origin, both in the etymology of the word and the story itself. However, the actual origins of the word are unknown. There are some who have suggested that it could have derived from the Swedish word psyche, which means small fairy. However, this has generally been disregarded by most people because geographically and time-wise, any Nordic influence in the southwest of Britain was really minimal. Part of the reason that the origin of the word is so unclear is because there's so much debate and sort of uncertainty regarding the correct spelling and pronunciation of the word. As I said, there's so many different variations, but they're all very slight, and sometimes it is literally just the spelling of the word that is slightly different, like it's a Y instead of an IE. Now, the difference in pronunciation and spelling is often a regional thing, so they were often referred to as piskies in Cornwall and parts of West Devon, but then as you moved further to the east of Devon, it transitioned into pixie. I did see one suggestion that I really liked that suggested the transformation from piskie to pixie was because of the Victorians, in that piskie may have been a little bit too close to the word piss to conservative Victorian ears. Now, whilst the exact etymology and origins of pixies is unknown, it is believed that pixie mythology existed in Britain before any kind of Christian presence. Again, with quite a few people believing that it developed from certain Celtic beliefs. Although interestingly, during the Christian era, pixies were said to be the souls of unbaptized children, which apparently fed into this larger idea that fairies and sort of fairy kind were connected to the spirits of the dead, or that fairies themselves were the dead. I did find a somewhat vague reference to something known as the hooded spirits from the Romano-Celtic region, and basically there were these figures that featured a lot in religious sculptures, depicted as these weird cloaked scurrying spirits. They were often described as being quite abstract in sort of shape, but the cloak in particular was associated with the Celts during the Roman period. Now, whilst there were a number of these sculptures and depictions found, the sort of religious significance of these figures is still fairly unclear, because so far no one has found any kind of inscription or text to go along with the figures. And other than this sort of loose suggestion that they may have been a possible ancient Celtic predecessor to pixie mythology, I couldn't really find any more information as to why that was. I thought I'd mention it, but one thing I did find quite a lot of reference to is an idea that developed, again, during the Victorian era. And it was the idea that pixie mythology had developed from the folk memory of what were known as the Pictish people. Now, these were a tribe of people who lived in like northern and eastern Scotland during the early Middle Ages. They were known to the Romans as the Picti, which roughly translated from Latin, I think means like the painted ones. And they were like the largest kingdom in the Dark Age of Scotland. But they were described as having these really intricate like body patterns and body art, which were believed to be forms of like scarification or types of tattoo, as well as being known for having blue body paint. I've saw one reference to this being like, think of like Braveheart with like the blue. Whilst it is quite an interesting theory, it has for the most part been sort of largely disproven, and it's often regarded instead as a piece of Norse propaganda against the Pictish people. But fun fact, it is believed that it's why in the Harry Potter series the Cornish Pixies were made blue as a reference to the Pictish people. Although others have argued that they were made blue as a sort of nod to Cornwall and a lot of Cornish things that are blue. There is another very interesting theory I found, that the mythology of pixies actually originated in an earlier race of human beings. Bear with me on this one because it's kind of wild, to be honest. So this theory is based on a discovery that was made in 2003 of a load of fossils that were found in a cave on an island in Indonesia. The fossils that were discovered were a brand new race of hominids, the earliest forms of human being, like alongside Homo sapiens. But it was known as the Homo floresiensis, or more infamously known as the Hobbit. Now, this particular individual, based on like the skeletal remains that they found, would have stood about 3'7", or like just over a meter high. And as of 2015, a further 15 partial skeletons of different individuals from this race have been discovered. So there are some that believe the real life stories of these people from like thousands of years ago have been passed down as like a racial memory through countless generations until they eventually evolved into this sort of mythology. There was actually a British scholar who stated his belief that pixies specifically were evidently part of a smaller race, and because of the kind of obscurity of any tales or information about them, he believed that they were based on an earlier race of human beings. Now, in traditional lore, pixies are believed to be very small creatures, often quite mischievous and somewhat like childlike, but overall harmless, and they usually wear like dirty, sort of tattered rags, or in a lot of cases, they're just naked. They're often believed to live in a lot of different types of ancient underground sites like stone circles, barrows, dolmens, or something known as menhirs. In more modern depictions, they're shown as having pointed ears, often wearing like green outfits or green clothing with like a pointed hat. Although, again, this was much more of a sort of Victorian era interpretation. Also during the Victorian era was when they were often depicted or described as having eyes that often like pointed upwards at the end. But a lot of the stuff that was around during the Victorian era interpretation of them is not considered part of the like original mythology. I love the idea actually that they were originally called Pixies and danced around naked, but the Victorians were like, oh, good heavens, no. So changed their name and put clothes on them. I'm not entirely sure where I'm going with this look, by the way, so please just bear with me. I'm hoping it's a trust the process kind of thing. I saw quite a few different debates about whether or not pixies sort of canonically have wings or not. Some they do, some they don't. There's no real confirmation of it. But in any depictions where they do have wings, they're often like quite wispy and they move incredibly fast. Now, pixies are known to be very fond of dancing and music and would often be seen in large groups gathering outside at night, sort of dancing in the moonlight to the sounds of frogs and crickets, wrestling with each other and sort of roughhousing, playing kind of like children do. And sometimes they were seen within like a ring of mushrooms, which were often believed to have been planted by the pixies themselves. To be fair, the whole like mushroom ring circle is very closely associated with things like fairies, and in some cases it's seen as a portal to like the fairy world or some other world. If you ever come across a circular ring of mushrooms, it is believed to be incredibly bad luck to remove or harm any of the mushrooms, or basically to break the circle in any way. Now, I found quite a few other connections between pixies and mushrooms in particular when I started looking into the whole idea of like pixie dust. Now, most of the initial searches and research into pixie dust led me straight back to Tinkerbell and Disney in general. And with regards to Tinkerbell, the pixie dust is like the sparkling golden dust that falls from her wings, and it allows people to fly. I know there's the really infamous scene in Peter Pan where he's like holding her by the wings and then like tapping her on the butt to make the dust fall off, which... Now, the lore behind pixie dust within the Disney universe is expanded later on in that pixie dust comes from the pixie dust tree, which is this ancient tree that has been around since the beginning of Pixie Hollow, which is where like Tinkerbell and all her friends and stuff live and come from. And it's the oldest known source of fairy dust or pixie dust in the entire like Never Fairies universe. However, the entire concept of like the pixie/fairy dust is much older, if a lot less well known than Disney's version. So pixie dust, also called fairy dust, has potential references in old Celtic folktales, as well as like a few French folktales from like the 19th century, generally a lot more leaning into the fairy tale side of things. In Celtic folklore, there is the tale of a fisherman who, one sort of dark, misty day, he sees a group of people who are all about a foot tall, basically dancing and making music in this little circle. And he ends up sitting and watching them for hours. He's completely entranced by them. However, when he decides to try and move a bit closer to them, they throw a load of dust in his eyes, which sort of temporarily blinds him. And while he's wiping it away from his face, the family and the group of people have all disappeared, and he never sees or hears from them again. It's similar to something I found called The Tale of Yallery Brown, which is about an elf who at one point blows like a dandelion puff into this young boy's face, and it goes into like his eyes and his ears, and he can't see. And then by the time the boy can see again, the tiny creature has disappeared. There's a fairy tale from 1820 called Marble Princess, in which a fairy godmother gives a prince a bag of like gold dust of the purest quality that he can use to blind serpents in order to fight them. There's another tale from 1862 that tells of a character who wakes up from a really confusing dream, claiming that fairy dust took away their 5 senses to another world of existence. So there's a lot of different tales and folklore that have pixie dust or fairy dust being used in a variety of different ways. But the original connection between fairies or pixies and this dust may have actually come from mushrooms. Now, there are many varieties of mushrooms that are actually named after or for fairies, because there is a very long history and association between creatures like fairies and pixies with mushrooms. And some people believe it's in part due to certain toadstools having like an hallucinogenic effect. There is one particular mushroom related to fairies that is known as the puffball, and it's a mushroom full of brown, like dust, spore-like particles that are released when it bursts. Some of the other names for this mushroom include things like puckball, puck fist, pixie puff, or devil's snuff box, which I think is my favourite. And apparently in this context, the word fist doesn't mean like a closed fist. I don't know where the connection comes from, but in this context, it means like fart or puff of gas. So the name of it almost translates to pixie fart. Now, in Scotland, these mushrooms were known as the blind man's ball or blind man's eye, and in the early 1800s, it was suggested that this nickname may have been because of the fact that a lot of people thought that these spores caused blindness. There was another theory that suggested pollen may have actually been linked to the concept of fairy dust or pixie dust. In most cases, pollen is a very bright goldeny yellow kind of colour. And obviously it has much stronger ties to the concept of the more modern like flower fairy, or the idea that pixies love flowers, that kind of thing. People who have a pollen allergy, it can affect your vision, and there's quite a lot of side effects that I guess way back when they wouldn't have really understood. They would have just seen this yellow dust particle in the air, and then people started having weird reactions to it. There was actually a Victorian educational book from like 1866 that claimed fairies refer to pollen as gold dust, and they used to like to sprinkle it over each other for sport, which I love that as a little fun fact, because imagine learning that at school. The more modern interpretation of like fairy or pixie dust can actually be linked to the story of the Sandman. Now, in European folklore, the Sandman is a creature or person who would sprinkle dust or sand into the eyes of children at night to send them to sleep and to give them dreams. There are multiple tales and stories that developed about the Sandman during the 19th century. Then in 1915, the dictionary itself defined the Sandman as a household elf. Now, around the same time, there was a play called Bluebell in Fairyland, which actually served as part of the inspiration behind the story of Peter Pan. And in it, the main characters travel to Fairyland as part of a dream. And there are references to the Dustman or Sandman sprinkling golden dust over them as they fall asleep. Then in J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan tale, which was originally published in 1904 as a play, and then as a novel in 1911, he massively popularised the more modern view of fairy dust, because from the moment that Peter Pan is like first physically appears in the novel, he is covered in fairy dust. Then with the animated Disney adaptation of the novel in 1953, the material was referred to as pixie dust, and that in itself has become like a really key phrase within the Disney universe, both like cinematically and to describe things that happen at like Disney destinations. So it's things like receiving a gift or special treatment, or sometimes it's like if cast members kind of go above and beyond for the guests. An example I found was like being given a room upgrade when you're staying there, or being asked to participate in a show, characters pretending that young children dressed as princesses are actually the princesses. Along that vein, I saw so many searches for people literally like asking how to get pixie dusted at Disney. Like, it's a whole thing. I'd never heard of it before. Also, slightly less wholesome side note than Disney's interpretation of it. The concept of pixie dust has obviously evolved quite a lot, but the roots of it stem to the idea of like altered perception, be it like loss of vision or hallucinations or dreams. And interestingly, fairy dust or angel dust are now slang terms for different types of drugs, which again kind of goes back to that link with like an altered state of mind or altered perception. Now, going back to the actual topic of this video, which is pixies, because I got really sidetracked on that one. They're often seen as having quite a strong affinity to nature and a particular fondness for horses and ponies. They're often believed to ride them for like hours during the night, and they really enjoy taking turns to like braid the horse's mane and tail, or like leave knots in it, that kind of thing. There was reference to many a farmer who awoke the next morning to find their horses absolutely exhausted with loads of braids and knots in their hair that signalled the pixies had been there before. Other aspects of their like mischievous behaviour included fairly benign things like blowing out candles, tapping and like banging on walls during the night, playing with water, that kind of thing. But they're also very well known for trying to lead travellers astray or lead men and women off their path, quite similar to like the will-o-wisp. This whole prank of like confusing people and leading them astray had no real ulterior motive. It wasn't to harm them or anything like that. It was just purely to sort of revel in the chaos of confusing people. But it gave rise to the term pixie-led, which describes someone who has become lost on an otherwise familiar road, and eventually went on to become a phrase used to describe a sort of general state of bewilderment or confusion. I myself am pixie-led. Okay, the brush isn't working, I have to use the sponge now. Now, there is some belief that you can protect yourself from being pixie-led by turning some part of your clothing inside out, like your coat or your jacket, wearing it inside out, or even as simple as like a sock or a pocket being turned out. Or another example was wearing your hat backwards. Now, I started looking into this particular aspect of pixies and I fell down yet another rabbit hole in that a lot of these creatures seem to have a general distaste for human clothing. Now, if you think of the children's song, Teddy Bear's Picnic, which was written in 1932, the song advised children, if you go down to the woods today, you better go in disguise. Now, while this song is referring to teddy bears, the advice of wearing a disguise when you go into the woods is much, much older, as the woodlands were notorious as being the home of fairy kind. I found a few folklore tales in particular that seem to sort of link this strange relationship between fairy kind and human clothing, one of which is the tale of a fairy woman who would come every night and peer in the window of a family home on the Isle of Barra in the Western Hebrides. The husband saw this fairy woman appearing every night and got really suspicious about it. And he eventually came to the conclusion that this fairy woman was watching their family, looking for her opportunity to basically kidnap his wife. So he came up with a plan to try and stop her. Now, back in the days of like thatched roof houses, it was a custom that once you had finished thatching the roof of a house, you would then use heather spun ropes across it. And at the time, the husband had been in the middle of spinning these ropes. He suggested to his wife that they trade places, so she would sit and spin the heather rope and he would take her place at the spinning wheel, which was traditionally the wife or the homemaker's job. That night, when the fairy woman made her appearance, she looked in the window and then said to the man, "You are yourself at the spinning wheel and your wife is spinning the heather rope." And following that, they received no more visits from the fairy woman. Now, based on that story alone, there's no clear reason why them just switching places seemed to foil the fairy's plans. However, the theme of changing roles and positions seems to be the most important part of it, which is evidenced in other folklore tales. One of which is the tale of two household fairies who were known on the island of Guernsey, who would regularly enter the cottage of this really poor couple at night in order to bake bread in their oven. Now, this couple, as I said, very poor, so they tried a number of different ways to earn money for themselves, including things like baking bread. One of the other ways was also spinning, and the wife would often sit up very late into the night at the spinning wheel. Now, she witnessed the two fairies coming into the home to use the oven, and she told her husband about it, who wanted to see them for himself. So one night, he took her place at the spinning wheel, but went one step further and disguised himself wearing her clothes in order to try and see them. But when the fairies arrived and saw that the husband was sat at the spinning wheel, they stated, "Tonight there is a beard, when the other night there was none." And they probably turned around and left, seeming almost angry, and they never visited again. So again, we have another instance of role reversal seeming to repel the fairies or defeat whatever sort of objective they have, with the man undertaking the traditionally female task and obviously going one step further by wearing his wife's clothes. The general idea behind it is that it's actually the change of clothes or the use of a disguise, however crude it may be, as he apparently still had a beard, that it's that defeats the fairies rather than the change in position. Now, relating back to the idea of pixies being part of fairy kind, there was also folktale of a young girl from Dartmoor who was stripped of all her clothes and carried off by pixies. When they found her, she was unharmed, she was perfectly happy, she was just playing with the pixies in the woods, just completely naked like they were. There was another tale as well from Argyllshire in Scotland of a wife who had been kidnapped by fairies, but over a period of 2 months, she would return to the home every night to tidy and look after the homestead and care for her children. But the husband never saw her, until one day when he was walking in the woods and he heard her voice calling out to him. She was hidden in a bush and began telling the husband that she desperately wanted to come home, but she couldn't because she had no clothes. So in order for her to leave the fairies and return home, her husband had to bring her an item of clothing in order to free her. Side note, before I get too into the next bit, I sat up quite late the other night and actually threw my back out, making this enormous bunch of teeny tiny little toadstools and mushrooms. And I'm very proud of them, and I wanted to give them a moment before I stick them all over my face. So I'm really hoping this works, otherwise I'm going to be so upset. Oh, I probably should have painted it first. Whoops. Okay, let me just wait for that to dry before I do anything else. So based on those previous stories, whilst there's no immediately obvious reason as to why the people in these tales needed to be stripped of their clothes, the tales do compound this idea that fairy folk, fairy kind, object to human clothing. Now, this is actually quite similar to the brownie from Scottish folklore, which is a sort of household spirit or like hobgoblin kind of creature that falls within the realm of fairy kind, who would come out at night to perform various chores and farmhouse work to assist the family. Now, brownies in particular are very proud creatures and are very, very easily offended, and they will leave the homes that they work at forever if they feel they have been insulted or snubbed or taken advantage of in any way. But one surefire way to insult them is to present them with a piece of clothing. There are many tales of brownies being given gifts of clothing which result in them leaving forever and refusing to do any kind of housework for that family again. Which, now that I think about it, is incredibly reminiscent of the house elves in, again, Harry Potter. Now, going back to pixies and the idea of like turning something inside out to avoid being pixie-led, there is a fairy lore expert, which, again, just dream job title, called Catherine Briggs, who proposed that turning your clothing inside out acted almost like a change of identity or a disguise, therefore freeing you from any kind of fairy enchantment, or similarly just confusing the fairy creature. The theory around the clothing is a really fascinating one, but there are many other tales where presenting a pixie specifically with clothing or even a piece of fabric was considered a welcome gift. Ribbon in particular is believed to be like exceptionally valuable to them, similar to like a magpie's attraction to something shiny or reflective. There was one tale from 1911 called the Piskie Thrasher, which was about a piskie who would visit a farm at night and just ruin and thrash the farmer's corn, until one night the farmer laid out a new suit for the piskie as sort of payment. And when the piskie came and saw the suit, he put it on and claimed, "Piskie fine and piskie gay, piskie now will fly away." And it was said that he never returned to the farm. There's another very well-known legend regarding pixies and their like appreciation for gifts and acts of compassion, and it's known as the legend of the bed of tulips. It's a legend that's known in Dartmoor, obviously the biggest home of the Pixies, and it's about an old woman who lives alone in a little cottage on the outskirts of a village. Now, while she lives alone, she's not lonely because she's often visited by like the children from the village, and she had a really friendly relationship with the animals and wildlife of the area. She'd often share her meals with them, and she would leave out food and water for them during the winter months in order to help them survive. She was particularly known for having an incredibly beautiful garden that she tended to like daily, full of a huge variety of flowers, including a bed of tulips. One night, as the old woman was like drifting off to sleep, she began to hear the sound of music, so she looked outside and saw a huge number of pixies dancing on her lawn. She noticed as well that the tulips in the bed were like swaying slightly to the music, and when she looked a bit closer, she saw that laying in the cup of each tulip was like a tiny little pixie baby, fast asleep, being rocked really gently by the flower, which, I've got to be honest, is one of the most adorable visuals I think I've ever heard of. Now, the old woman was just absolutely delighted that the pixies had honoured her garden and vowed that she would always ensure there were tulips available to them. Eventually, she noticed that the flowers in her garden, and the tulips in particular, were growing bolder and brighter in colour and just growing better as a result of these pixies. And this sort of mutual exchange of kindness lasted for years, until eventually the old lady passed away peacefully in her sleep. Now, following this, the cottage was taken over by one of the villagers who deemed that the lawn and the flower bed were basically a waste of space, so he dug up the flowers and the lawn in order to plant vegetables there. Now, he would chase away any birds or wildlife that came near it, and he eventually put a fence up around the garden to stop animals from getting in. The pixies, however, were deeply upset by the loss of their like dancing space and their tulip cradles, so they vowed that nothing would ever grow in that garden again. And sure enough, every year, all the vegetables failed. And the garden eventually just became this like super barren, dry piece of dirt. However, the Pixies did not forget their relationship and their friendship with the old woman, as shortly after this, a huge mass of flowers, particularly tulips, bloomed at the side of her grave, and have bloomed there ever since as a mark of affection from her pixie friends. Again, it's one of the most adorable stories. No, other than folk tales and like general superstitions about turning your pockets inside out so you don't get lost, there aren't many practices or traditions that have survived about pixies, except in Devon with something that is known as Pixie Day. Now, Pixie Day is a celebration that takes place in the eastern town of Ottery St Mary during the month of June. The celebration marks the legacy of the pixies that previously inhabited the town before they were banished to live in a load of caves close by that became known as Pixie's Parlour. The legend can be traced back to like the earliest days of Christianity in Britain, when a local bishop decided to build a church in the town and commissioned new church bells to be made in a foundry in Wales. Now, these bells would obviously need to undertake this incredibly long and very dangerous journey from Wales all the way down to Ottery St Mary, accompanied by a group of monks. Now, the Pixies did not like the church bells because they believed that each time the bell rang, a pixie would die, and it would in general signal like the end of their rule over this town. So they tried to lead the monks astray from their path, and eventually were able to redirect them to a really sheer cliff edge, until one of the monks stubbed his toe on a rock, then invoked God to bless his soul, which allegedly broke the enchantment of the pixies and meant that the church bells did in fact make it to the town. The sound of the church bells eventually drove the pixies to take refuge in Pixie's Parlour, but once every June they would emerge from this cave to capture the bell ringers and lead them to the cave to eventually then be rescued by the vicar. But the Pixie Day celebrations often include reenactments of this legend and this story by like local school children and local kids clubs like Scouts, Brownies, that kind of thing, where the children dress up as the pixies and chase the bell ringers around the town, eventually capturing them for the vicar to inevitably rescue them. But as well as that, it's like a fair, there's stalls, there's entertainment and food. It reminds me a lot of like the Mothman Festival, but again, a bit more wholesome. Now, where pixies tend to fall under the category of like fairy creatures or fairy kind, there are other creatures that are remarkably similar to them, including things like the spriggan from Cornish folklore, which is actually often considered to be like the malevolent equivalent of a pixie. Spriggans are often described as being very small in build, but often like grotesquely ugly, often described as looking like wizened old men, but with really large, childlike heads. Despite their small stature, they are often believed to be the ghosts of giants, and they've retained some of that like gigantic strength. There are some tales as well where they're able to like swell up to their original giant size, but they are notorious for having really unpleasant demeanors and temperaments. They delight in mischief and misfortune, particularly against those who offend them, but slightly more maliciously than pixies do. They're known for sending like whirlwinds to try and terrify travellers, storms in order to ruin crops and farmland, and in some cases they steal away mortal children and leave a really ugly changeling in their place. Spriggans were also often blamed for any kind of misfortunes that happened in the area, like houses being robbed or buildings collapsing, cattle escaping, that kind of thing. But there is one tale of a woman who bested a band of Spriggans by turning her pockets inside out in order to fool them and like steal all of their stuff. There's actually a really famous sculpture of a Spriggan that was made in 1993 in Crouch End in London, in like one of the arches lining sections of a disused rail line. Now, I knew of Spriggans previously because they are featured as fey creatures in Dungeons & Dragons, but they also feature in the Elder Scrolls game series, with a lot of their designs being based on that sculpture in London. In the southwest of England, particularly in like Dorset and the New Forest, there is local mythology of a creature known as the Colt Pixie, which is a type of pixie that takes the form of a scruffy, pale horse or pony in order to lead travellers and other livestock astray. The earliest surviving written reference to a Colt Pixie dates back to like the early 16th century, and it gave rise to the phrase ragged as a cult pixie, which was common in the New Forest even as recently as like the early 20th century. Another mischievous creature that is often associated with, and in some cases confused with, the pixie is the imp. However, these are a bit more broadly from like European mythology and are generally considered more similar and more akin to like demons than pixies and fairies. I definitely should have painted these before I put them on. Whoops. Now, imps are often described as quite troublesome, very mischievous creatures rather than anything seriously like dangerous or threatening, despite their associations with demons and the attendants to the devil. It was predominantly Christian folklore that ended up depicting demons and devils as strictly like evil creatures, because a lot of demons in things like Germanic folklore, they were closer to imps, being more like pranksters rather than anything super harmful. They're often described as very small creatures and generally pretty ugly ones at that. And their behaviour is described as like wild and uncontrollable, both in the positive sense of being like a free spirit and taking enjoyment in life, and the more annoying prankster type. Although I didn't realise imps were often portrayed as incredibly lonely creatures, and the act of pranking and practical jokes on humans was actually their attempts to try and establish a friendship with them, but most of the time it backfired because the humans would get annoyed, which would then drive the imps away. And then on the occasion that an imp was successful in gaining friendship with a human, they would continue to prank said human, either because they were bored or because it was simply in their nature to do so, which led to the use of the word impish to describe someone who enjoys pranks and practical jokes. It eventually became believed that imps were the familiar spirits and like servants of witches and warlocks, and that they served as like spies and informants for them. So during the witch trials, supernatural creatures were hunted as proof of witchcraft, though as we know, this was more often just the case of a black cat or other like uncommon animal as a pet. Cool, so my life just had a little mini freak out, so if there's a weird change in continuity, I do apologise. But I need to go and try and fix these mushrooms up quickly, and I'm nearly at the end of what I have to say. So let me go sort this out and do the last finishing touches, and then we can be back to finish the story. This look is currently a sensory nightmare, and when I tell you I have fake moss everywhere, because I ordered fake moss, but it smells and feels suspiciously like real moss, like dried. I think the moss has definitely helped with the whole mushroom vibe. I'm not sure if the eyes really go with the rest of the look anymore, but I think overall I'm quite happy with it. Now, going back to where I was, if you travel over to Mexico and parts of Southern America, there is a creature known as the, please forgive me, Chanek, or the Ohuican Chanek, as they were called by the Aztecs, meaning those who inhabit dangerous places. They are a small sprite or pixie-like being that hold a connection to the elemental forces and are often regarded as like guardians of nature. There are comparable mythical beings that are also found across like Mesoamerican and Latin American folklore, often referred to as the duende in Spanish. Now, the Chanek have a very long history in Mexico, being found in Mesoamerican legends, as well as documents written by like the Spanish Inquisition. And there's a lot of debate among scholars as to whether the Chanek and the duende are the same creature or not, because they share a lot of the same characteristics despite having different names in different parts of the world. From what I found, certain types of the duende are slightly more comparable to like dwarves and gnomes, and the name comes from the Indo-European word dema, which means connected to the home. The root word for that being dem, meaning house or household. And the name duende stems from the fact that they are often connected to a particular home and will often bother the individuals of that home. The Chanek, however, tend to live in like forests and rivers and caves, that kind of thing, and they're more connected to nature, and they're presented in Mexican folklore as both evil, harmful creatures as well as good creatures who want to try and help. They're believed to be able to communicate with all the animals of the jungle, given that they provide protection for the natural elements, but they're not always visible to adults, but it's generally accepted that children can see them, which again is something that I saw reference to with pixies. Villagers used to give offerings to the Chinook in exchange for protection for both their crops and the harvest, as well as protection for their homestead and their families, and generally as a way to try and help ward off intruders or evil spirits, because it was believed that the Chinook are able to intimidate intruders to the point where the intruder's soul will literally leave his body, and unless a very specific ritual is performed in order to connect the soul back to the body, the intruder would fall very, very ill and then eventually die. But in more modern interpretations and more modern legends, the Chinook are portrayed as children with the faces of elderly men or women who trick people and can then lead them astray for several days. Anyone who falls victim to this is said to experience memory loss for the duration of their disappearance, which is mainly due to their alleged transport to the underworld. Interestingly enough though, a known way of protecting yourself from being led astray by the Chinook and taken to the underworld was to turn part of your clothing inside out. One thing I did find while I was looking into the duende side of things in Spanish folklore, so there are numerous variations and types of duende, one of which are known for being very mischievous pranksters, and they are known as the Dianos. So the Dianos are known for adopting the form of different types of animals and sometimes even human babies in order to trick people. So they're mostly active at night, they cause endless noise and disruptions, they cause mysterious lights, and they basically try and frighten anyone who is out walking late at night, as well as trying to disorient any peasants who are out looking for their cattle or things like that. They annoy the millers who tend to mill in the moonlight, and they will follow and mock people who are arriving home late from parties. One of the most common pranks that they pull is to turn themselves into a white donkey and then offer themselves as a mount to a passerby. However, once the person is on said mount, the donkey will just grow increasingly larger. And another variation of that is that they would turn into a white horse. However, rather than taking them where they wanted to go, they would take them on a hellish gallop before eventually returning the person to the place where they originally started. Which honestly is kind of funny. I mean, I'm sure it's not for the person who's being dragged around not knowing where they are, but from the outset, it's a little funny. But so brings us to the end of my notes, because I didn't write in a way to tie this story off. So, I really enjoyed doing the research for this one. It was a little bit more lighthearted and a bit more fun than, because some of the ones that I look at are really dark. But as always, let me know what you think in the comments down below of Pixies, their stories, their origins. Let me know what you think of the look as well. Like I say, I think I'm very happy with it. I've got moss everywhere, but overall I think it's come together. It's maybe leaning a bit more elfy. Maybe if I had wings. I don't have any wings. I should have bought wings. Shameless self-promo moment for a moment. What? Shameless self-promo for a moment. Please do not forget to like, subscribe, notification bells, all that general crap. Obviously your engagement and your interaction really helps me, and it's nice to know that people actually enjoy these kind of videos as well. So I love reading through the comments that you guys leave. It's really fascinating, when people share their own experiences with the particular stories or what they heard growing up. I love hearing from people who live in other countries and their versions as well. It is endlessly fascinating to me, and I appreciate all of you who interact with me. As I said at the beginning, don't forget to join my little broadcast channel on Instagram. I'll be posting behind the scenes stuff and sneak peeks, and it's just a really nice way for me to have you guys be a bit more involved in this series, because I want it to be a bit more of a collaborative effort, I guess. I think that's everything I usually cover in my intro. I don't know, it's been so long since I've filmed, I feel like I'm starting from scratch again, so if this makes no sense, I'm really sorry. Other than that, I hope you have a fabulous day. I am very appreciative of all of you, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye bye. Okay.